Good evening, everyone, and welcome viewers to the last session of our 13th annual convention this year. Typically, the last session of our conference is a festive one with an extraordinary array of debka, music, and cultural displays that reinforce the reason why we continue to celebrate our resistance as a people and cause. This year, however, we did have to go virtual due to the pandemic, with the hope that we can all return together soon to celebrate, learn, and grow as a people. Tonight, we are ending our conference with a discussion on the role of the Palestinian diaspora in the national project. We had a session in Arabic on the subject on Friday and are continuing this today. Undoubtedly, the role of the Palestinian diaspora has waned in recent decades, despite the fact that the diaspora has historically played a foundational role in the development of the Palestinian liberation movement. For a people whose population was scattered across the globe, a civilization nearly shattered by a settler colonial enterprise that sought to erase us, we yearned and sought for salvation from God and anyone who can provide it. After being disappointed regionally and internationally, the diaspora, or as we call it, the shatat, formed student unions, academic councils, political alliances, and liberation movements to bring our people up. From being lost in the deserts of the Arab world to a people determined to liberate ourselves from Zionism and Western imperialism, it was, in fact, the diaspora communities who led this work for decades and which gained global support and solidarity for our cause. Since the Oslo Accords were signed in the early 1990s, the role of the Palestinian diaspora has been diminished significantly and relegated to humanitarian intervention and shows of solidarity. While this work is important in its own right, the Palestinian institutions that were representative of all Palestinians in Palestine and abroad have ceased to exist, leaving the diaspora on the sidelines of the national project. Beyond building and sustaining international solidarity with Palestine, how are and can the Palestinian diaspora play a stronger role in the future of Palestine? Joining me tonight to tackle this issue head-on are three wonderful friends of mine that I'm so happy to have with me joining in this beautiful discussion: Lara Kiswani, Dr. Loubna Qutami, and Raed Jarrar. Lara Kiswani is from Beit Iksa and was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has been active in movements against war, Palestinian self-determination, and third world solidarity movements for the last 20 years. She is a lecturer at San Francisco State University in the College of Ethnic Studies and the executive director of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. Lara, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Loubna Qutami is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Qutami is a former President's postdoctoral fellow from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and received her PhD from the Department of Ethnic Studies at my alma mater, the University of California, Riverside, and her master's from the College of Ethnic Studies, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program at San Francisco State University. Dr. Loubna is an alumna of the Palestinian Youth Movement and the General Union of Palestine Students at San Francisco State University. She is also the former executive director of the Arab Cultural and Community Center in San Francisco. Raed Jarrar is our very own AMP's Advocacy Director. He's a Palestinian-American blogger and political advocate based in the Washington, D.C. area. Since his immigration to the United States in 2005, he has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to Palestine and the United States engagement in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the Middle East, he has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings, led national advocacy days in Washington, and is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in both Arabic and English. My dear respected panel, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Lara, why don't you kick us off with some opening remarks about the topic at hand?
I want to start by just thanking AMP for all the work you all do to advance the Palestinian liberation movement and also for organizing this convention. The topic of today's panel is quite intriguing to me, both because we rarely get asked to discuss the role of Palestinians in diaspora, and instead we find ourselves left to make interventions in discussions about Palestinian solidarity and to declare that Palestine is not just some place over there, but is a global struggle and involves the leadership of Palestinians everywhere. So also, because this topic allowed me to reflect and to be curious and ground myself in both the present, the past, and the future of our movement. So I'm really grateful for this discussion. I want to start by reflecting on the Palestinian National Project, the topic at hand, and ground myself in the fact that the Palestinian National Project is an international project. It's an anti-imperialist project, an anti-colonial project. So as the United States and Europe and Israel have managed to shift the narrative of the struggle of Palestine away from that of dispossession, colonialism, and anti-imperialism into a conflict between states and political actors. But in fact, the Palestinians in diaspora and Arabs in the United States rupture that narrative. How we engage in Palestine solidarity, what we do around Palestine solidarity work actually resituates Palestine as an internationalist struggle. And this is especially important as Israel continues to co-opt progressive spaces, to whitewash, pinkwash its racism, supremacist, and apartheid practices, and with the support of the West, and I know we'll be talking about this more, has obliterated the Palestinian left, creating historical amnesia about the history of internationalism, third worldism, and joint struggle between Palestinian and other Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latin American movements across the world. Palestinians in diaspora are building on that history of third worldism. We are building on decades of joint struggle where solidarity was not simply about connecting identities, but about shared experience, about shared political projects, visions, and strategies for liberation. So as Palestinians, we know we can't fight for Palestine and against settler colonialism and militarism abroad without fighting its domestic manifestations, that being the violence against other Black, Brown, and Indigenous people here. Joint struggle, that's something that our movements have always done. So solidarity is not new. It is what makes the Palestinian struggle so central to all struggles against oppression. And we know this history. We know that during the Irish hunger strike in 1981, that was led by Bobby Sands, a statement was smuggled out of Nafha prison from the Palestinian prisoners and sent to the families of the 10 men who died. During the 1960s and 70s, the Palestinian guerrilla movement in Lebanon and Jordan had supporters from across Japan, Spain, Italy, Germany, Argentina, Colombia, Nicaragua, Iran, South Africa, Turkey, and across the Arab world. So, and Palestinians in the US, many of whom are my political mentors, organized against apartheid South Africa, supported Central American struggles against US-backed coups, and built with Native communities. That was reflected in the work of our counterparts like SNCC, the Black Panther movement, and AIM. So as we engage today in a discussion about Palestinians in diaspora, about Arabs in diaspora, I'm really eager to do so by complicating the concept of solidarity. So can we, for instance, understand Palestinian solidarity as a political project, not merely a sensibility, an anti-colonial project that entails action and supporting the centrality of the leadership most impacted, in this case, Arabs and Palestinians, and building movements and building across movements. You know, we know today, and I'm sure that's been discussed in plentiful across this convention, you know, Palestine is a wedge issue. So what's possible if we equip ourselves and our allies with the tools necessary to create more wedges between Zionism and progressive movements, and to understand the domestic manifestations of fascism and white supremacy as inextricably linked to the Zionist colonial project? So how do we understand this moment and its vulnerabilities? How can we build power as Arabs in diaspora? How can we shift conditions that are threatening the well-being of everybody? And what kind of solidarity and united front are we building? I'm curious to hear from my co-panelists about this, and I'm sure that we all understand the liberation of Palestine not only as the liberation of Palestinian people, but actually contributing to the global struggle against US imperialism. And in fact, us being right here in the United States, situated in a very unique position to both lift up Palestinian solidarity, but also make interventions and advances that can contribute to our global movements.
Thank you, Lara. That was amazing. And you posed some very important questions that I hope we can get to later in the panel. Dr. Loubna, please give us some opening remarks as well.
Thank you, Taher and Lara, Raed. So great to join you all in this important conversation. Congratulations to AMP on your 13th annual conference. Against All Odds is a very fitting theme, I think, this year, showing that you've managed to put together this incredible virtual conference for the first time with flying colors. So we want to thank you for your continued service to our struggle and congratulate you for another wonderful event this year. I think, I think that this, what Lara brings up is so critical, that Palestine is more than just a Palestinian national struggle, or that in fact the Palestinian national struggle is and always has been an internationalist struggle, right? We've always known that there can't be a liberation of Palestine without the liberation of the region and without the complete liberation from all forces of systemic oppression and imperialism. But I think when we think specifically about the question of the US diaspora, rather than sort of making an argument about why the role of the diaspora is important in my own opinion, I think it's valuable to sort of look back at our own history. Arab organizing history in the US, especially in the first half of the 1900s, is really the site where a lot of Palestinian political organizing was taking place. Newly arriving Arab immigrants in the first part of the 1900s started mobilizing in the United States in response to both their racial positionality against systemic forms of oppression in the US, which at that time classified citizenship, property ownership, and many other sorts of political and civil freedoms and benefits to white people. And that's what we mean by whiteness as a system and a set of policies, and not just something that we use discursively, right? So Arab organizing in the early 1900s was really in relationship to acquiring political freedoms and rights based on their positionality here in the US, but it was also in relation to and contributing to the political developments that were unfolding in the region. So for example, in 1915, the formation of the Free Syria Society was really developing the ideological tenets of what would become Syrian nationalism, and at that time, it's not just Syria, right? Greater Syria. And the idea of constructing the preparation of Arab peoples for freedom and sovereignty from Ottoman rule, right? And this was sort of happening in tandem with the Great Arab Awakening of the period, the intellectual movement that spawned the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And then that kind of organizing evolved into the formation of the New Syria Party in 1925, where Arab immigrants were forming not only now in relationship to Arabs declaring Arab sovereignty from Ottoman rule, but in the looming shadows of the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which had solidified European imperial ambitions in the Arab region. And so now Arab immigrants and Arab organizers in the United States were really developing the political trajectory to get Arab people free from European imperialism. And this was in tandem with the Great Arab Revolt of 1925, the Druze-led rebellion against the French. And those kinds of efforts mirror what came after them, right? So in 1936, Arab immigrants in the US established the Arab National League. This was really important. The ANL was established in the United States before it was established as a political body in our region, right? It was a new political body established to address the impending Zionist aspirations for conquest. It was happening at the same time as the declaration of the Great Arab Revolt against Zionist land annexation and labor disposability policies of Arab workers in Palestine, and against Zionist aspirations. By 1944, Arab immigrants organized under a new umbrella, the Institute for Arab-American Affairs. And this was really to account for new post-World War II geopolitical and global power relations, understanding that the United States was beginning to become a heavy player in the region, and that what would become eventually the oil wars that were launched against Arab lands and people. So Arab immigrants in the United States in the early half of the 1900s really were not just, the organizing was not just reflected of the changes happening back home, but they were establishing ideological tenets, they were establishing resources, they were establishing trajectories for political mobilization in a dialectical relationship with organizers in the homeland. By 1952, we are 4 years out of the 1948 Nakba, and as student movements were really developing across the Arab region, we saw the establishment of the Organization of Arab Students here in the United States, which became one of the most vibrant organizing bodies that insisted on an end to all forms of imperialism in the region and the liberation of Palestine from Zionist conquest. And by 1967, when the United States really, following the '67 war, when the United States really affirmed their political and military and economic aid to Israel and reactionary Arab regimes to stifle the growing Palestinian guerrilla insurgency, that was when we saw an entirely new era of Arab organizing in the US. Groups, for example, like the Arab American University graduates, they were formed in the wake of the 1967 war to dispel notions of Palestinians and Arabs as bloodthirsty terrorists within popular cultural and academic discourses in the United States that were becoming increasingly limited to share Palestinian or Arab perspectives on the political developments of the region. So those are just some of the early examples of how Arab organizing in the United States was always done in relationship to these transnational circuits of power and influence, and contributed to remaking of political phases in the region. By the 1970s, a lot of Palestinian organizing in the United States became sort of nationalized, just as the Palestinian struggle became nationalized. And that is when we started to see the emergence of Palestinian national institutions, the women's unions, the student unions, and they had, many different kinds of roles that they played. They always saw themselves as part of a broader ecosystem with other spiritual-based institutions, with Arab cultural-based institutions, and with each other, right? Some fronts really tackled the solidarity front. Others really tackled the engagement of everyday grassroots communities in the struggle. And those unions really lasted through the 1980s, even though the Palestinian national movement experienced a devastating blow following the PLO's exodus from Beirut in 1982. So this was a period of time in the 80s where the Palestinian national struggle experienced a lot of precarity, another forced exodus. By the late 1980s, we were seeing the global context rapidly transform, with cuts to financial aid and cuts to political support within the region and on a global scale to the Palestinian leadership. But this did not necessarily stop the Palestinian community in the United States from playing the role that they could in the United States to maintain and sustain the struggle and to play their part. But of course, and we'll get back to this during the rest of the panel, by 1993, that rapidly transformed and changed, because that moment really crystallized the liquidation of many of these Palestinian grassroots unions and institutions. Of course, some unions and institutions continued on playing different kinds of roles, and some were able to reorganize. We saw an emergence of a whole new scene of Palestinian organizing at that moment also, and we can return to that. But the Oslo Accords really did sort of crystallize the end of official or de jure set of relations between the grassroots organizing efforts of Palestinian communities in the United States and the Palestinian political establishment.
Thank you, Loubna. And that was a wonderful overview and general discussion, because this actually informs a lot of what we're going to be talking about later, hopefully. Raed, would love to hear your thoughts as well as some opening remarks.
Yeah, I would love to share some thoughts from my perspective as someone who lives in Washington, D.C. And spends all of my time on advocacy efforts with the federal government. But before I say that, I do want to speak for a minute about the definition of diaspora. And I think that is something very important for us as Palestinians to also recognize that half of the Palestinian people live in the diaspora. Half of us live in historic Palestine between the 1948 as citizens of Israel, or in Gaza, or in the West Bank. The other half live literally all around the world. So someone like me, for example, I was born in Iraq, and I grew up in Saudi Arabia and Jordan. My family lived in other countries around the Middle East, Lebanon, Egypt. There are different pockets of the diaspora, the Palestinian diaspora. And we have different legal status in many of these countries. Like, for example, the majority of Palestinians here in the US are Palestinian-Americans. We are citizens. Palestinians in the diaspora, out of the 6 million Palestinians in the diaspora, half of us almost are stateless with no documents. So even like it's a very mixed community, and you have some people who are second and third generation Palestinian in the diaspora here in North America or South America, and there are people like me. My grandparents were in Haifa during '48, and they left Haifa to Jenin, and left Jenin in 1967. So we have, from the UNRWA, we have both refugee and IDP cards. And I was born in Iraq. Now I live here, where my kids were born in DC. So it's the first point that I want to make is that the Palestinian diaspora is really enormous. It's very spread around the world. And one thing that we can do as Palestinians in the diaspora is to also organize with other Palestinians in the diaspora. I think Palestinians in historic Palestine have a much better, well-defined boundaries, social structures. But for us, spread all around the world, that is one point for us to actually organize. And I have been involved in a few initiatives around the world where people have been trying to put Palestinians from all different continents in the same room to have conversations about who we are and how we view our identity, our identities, and how can we work together within that. So that's something I wanted to point out while we're discussing this. Palestinian-Americans, you know, like for us, there are many ways to participate in building this Palestinian identity, maintaining it, and participating in what we're referring to here as a Palestinian project. One way to do this is through government advocacy. And I know that this is not a very easy issue to discuss in the United States, because the US government has historically been a part of the problem. It's been a part of the human rights violations that Palestinians deal with on a daily basis. And many, if not most, of Israel's violations and occupation and war crimes are funded and subsidized by US tax dollars. So there are mixed feelings here in our communities about the value and the impact of engaging with the US government. And historically, that was a big problem for us. So many people just, you know, threw their hands in the air and said, there is nothing we can do. It's naive to try to impact the United States government. The US government's relationship with Israel is beyond repair. It can't be changed. And I completely disagree with this narrative. This narrative has neutralized huge sections of our communities inside the United States. The apathetic narrative that says it doesn't make any difference and it will not have any impact, and therefore we should do nothing. We should not speak to the US Congress, and we should not even attempt to engage with the US government. This is still a prevailing narrative in some communities. I would say it has shifted over the last decade or two. And I'm happy that it's shifting because we are actually making a difference in Washington, D.C. And the political climate in D.C. has shifted dramatically since 9/11. There is a much bigger political space to organize for Palestine, to speak about Palestinian rights, and to have Palestinian voices be a part of the discourse in Washington, D.C. These things did not exist when I moved to D.C. back in 2005. The biggest achievement at the time that we could dream of was having maybe 2 or 3 members of Congress skip the vote, vote present on some pro-Israel resolutions. That was the maximum, the ceiling for what we were dreaming of at the time. And this moved to a place where now we have dozens of members of Congress who are willing to speak publicly about issues pertaining to Palestinian rights. I'll give very quick 2 examples here before I give the floor back to Taher. The first example is actual legislation. We have a couple of actual pieces of legislation in the US Congress to support Palestinian rights. This hasn't happened before. A very new phenomenon. As we speak now, there are 2 pieces of legislation, 2407 and 8050. One of them has to do with the US funding for Israel that ends up being used to imprison Palestinian children. So that's one bucket. And the other bucket is regarding the impending Israeli annexation and how the US should not be funding and aiding such a war crime. Now, these 2 legislation are actually an extremely different shift in the political environment in DC. I can speak about them more later. So, but these are like the legislation is one example. The other example are congressional letters that we have been helping with drafting and sending from members of Congress. Back in the day, we used to have 2, 3, 4, 5 members of Congress who are willing to say something about Palestinian rights. This year, it has been amazing. We have had so many congressional letters with 50 and 60 members of Congress signing on to them. I would mention Congressman Ro-Khanna's letter regarding home demolition had 64 congressional signatures on it. There are a couple of letters sent by that were led by Congressman Pocan, including one that AMP has helped with just last week. We ended up with 40 members of Congress signed on a congressional letter that was open only for a week. These numbers are really huge. They are an indication of a huge shift in Washington, D.C. So before I end my opening remarks here, Taher, I want to say, if there is one thing to remember from what I just said now, it is that talking to your members of Congress and engaging the U.S. government is important, and it is working. And we need all hands on deck. We need to pressure the U.S. government as much as we could, because we are making a big difference here in D.C. The things that we were dreaming about 10 years ago, we're actually living now. And now we have to dream even bigger for what could happen in the next decade.
Thank you, Raed, for that introduction. And I think you opened up a discussion here about political disenfranchisement and the efficacy of advocacy work that I think is very important. And I hope we have a chance to delve into that in this program. I actually wanted to pose a question that I think many of us sort of think about as Palestinian. And I'm speaking from my standpoint as an organizer and as a youth activist who considers myself still part of the youth community. How much has factionalism inside Palestine informed the way we organize in the diaspora? And the follow-up question would be, are we moving away from that, or is it too deeply entrenched in our internal fibers? And is that something that we even want to move away from? Maybe is another follow-up question. And I'll pose that question to any of you who would like to tackle that, because I feel like that's something that is constantly being brought up, and is something that is a point of departure for many people, especially when they're getting involved at a broader national level in the work for Palestine.
Lara, do you want to go first, or?
No, why don't you go ahead?
Taher, thank you. It's a great question. I think one of the things that we really struggle with in terms of thinking of the Palestinian National Project, or Palestine politically in terms of history, is that sometimes we have a little bit of a glorification of that history, especially from this vantage point post-Oslo, where we feel like, Palestinians have lost more land and more life as a result of Oslo, and our movement seems really fractured, especially in the last decade after the Arab uprisings, and a lot of the opportunities and possibilities that a lot of us were hoping for in that period, just sort of seeing that dissolve, and seeing a lot of opportunities close. So it feels like we're in a moment of a really bleak political moment, and there's a lot of despair across the board. We're now 15 years into the split in national unity following 2006, almost 30 years after Oslo. So it feels like the factionalism part is part of our day-to-day challenge working in Palestinian politics, even in the diaspora. It does affect Palestinian households, whether or not it's between organizations, but even Palestinians within the same household will have those arguments at the dinner table, right? But I think that one of the things that we have to be careful of is the sort of romanticization that factionalism didn't exist before 93. We existed with a nationalist framework. Within a nationalist framework, there's always going to be different factions with different ideological leanings and strategic differences, political disputes. But I think that before Oslo, or maybe even, let's not even say before Oslo, let's say, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was some common national principles that all Palestinian factions, despite, to what faction a person belonged, they believed in. And that was the liberation of all of Palestine, the return of all of the refugees. And I think that even if that factionalism during that period was playing out in credibility wars, legitimacy wars between groups and leaders, especially between this kind of charismatic leadership that we've had as a long part of our Palestinian political tradition, at the end of the day, the sort of political vision of a lot of those factions fell onto the same page when it came to the ultimate political goal. And I think that following Oslo, that's changed. We have competing political visions, and they are backed by different geopolitical forces. They are backed by different political trends happening in the region and globally. So it feels like this factionalism is new to us, when in reality, it's always been there. What is perhaps new is that it's so difficult to revitalize a shared unifying political national project. It's not just about a unified leadership or a unified set of representatives, right? It's about the fact that there seems to be an absence of a collective national project whereby the Palestinians inside of Gaza and Tamani al-Rain and the West Bank and the refugee camps in the Arab region and across the Shatat are part of that process of building that vision, of building the infrastructure to carry it the way that we might have had before 93 and before the sort of de facto collapse of the PLO. And so, yes, I think factionalism is still an issue in our society today. And I think that rather than get hung up on how to resolve or how to recreate a sense of national unity, what we have to do is be coming together as grassroots communities and think about what we want our future to look like and how we can build, even if we're playing different roles in this broader ecosystem of our movement, how we can build toward that anti and decolonial vision of our future Palestine. Taher, just to answer your question, I think that opportunity is actually really going very well right now in the United States. There's a lot of cross-movement collaboration, a lot of collaboration between different intergenerational cooperation, cross-sector cooperation in our community, because I think that the conditions have left no other opportunities for us otherwise.
Yeah,
Lara?
I would just, I appreciate Loubna's comments, and I think, really at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that at some point we had a very vibrant movement, and there were a lot of political struggles, and there were ideological differences and strategic differences. And while we can look back at that and just, dismiss it as factionalism, that was something negative, we could also learn from that in terms of what kind of political struggles existed in the past that we can actually then build on today. I think what we're lacking today is less of different visions and strategies and more about what is our strategy in terms of a Palestinian national project. What are we trying to accomplish both in diaspora and on the ground in Palestine? And how do we not separate those two things? But I think in many ways, absolutely, factionalism still exists, and we can say so outside of Palestine, within the Arab region. There's many dinner table conversations we could unpack today in our family and households. But at the end of the day, the factionalism that existed pre-Oslo actually was generative, right? It produced a lot of practice, it produced struggle that advanced our movement. And what we're seeing today is a lack of that political unity at all, where there's no real political struggle. And so what I'm always curious about is, what is our strategy today? So it's less about how is factionalism actually impacting us. I see that less so in the United States and in diaspora, and more it's a question of what are we trying to accomplish? What path are we paving to get there? And how are we doing it? And so I think there's a lot of potential. I agree with everything that everyone said around this moment and what's possible. But I also think what's lacking is that strategy question, which in the days of intense factionalism existed. And that's where I think there's some generative work around political struggle that we could also build on and learn from. 100%.
Raed, you wanted to interject? Go ahead.
I wanted to add something that, I might be more optimistic when it comes to the Palestinian diaspora in the US, Palestinian-Americans, because I do agree with the analysis provided my co-panelists here, that the situation in Palestine is deteriorating, and the Palestinian voice in historic Palestine is divided and not as clear as it was decades ago. And I think the situation, even with the diaspora, in many of their locations around the region, is much worse than it was a few decades ago. Just look at Palestinians in Iraq or Syria. The situation is painful when we compare it to how it was decades ago. Our situation here in the US, we're actually among the more organized diaspora communities. Palestinians in the US have grown to be a very organized and sophisticated community. We have a very coherent voice inside the United States. Our voice in the United States is mostly based on telling our own government to stop being a part of the problem. That's what our voice is. And Palestinians in the United States have been very smart in setting their differences of strategic solutions aside. While we're advocating for Palestinian rights, we say we don't take a position on the one-state or two-state solutions. That is smart. We know where most of us stand on these issues, but we don't make that a point of division, because we do have many points of unity. Our other point of unity and success, in addition to us being organized, is that Palestine has become a progressive issue in the United States. This is an amazing victory. Palestine is literally one of the few litmus tests for the progressive movement, for if people are actually progressives, are willing to look at our domestic and foreign policies, with no exceptions. Palestine is the question, and Palestine is the issue. And we see that Palestine is in the heart of very, very powerful movements and conversations in 2020. The movement for Black Lives. Palestine is centered in that movement, the same way that we as Palestinians are also centering the lives of Black people and African Americans and their fight for justice and freedom in the United States. Many other important movements, the environmentalist movement in the US, movements for indigenous rights in the US. Palestine has become an intersectional movement, and that is an amazing success. That Palestine became bigger than us. It became bigger than only Palestinian Americans, and we did that. We succeeded in making Palestine a big policy and cultural and art and political issue that others can't avoid. So I just want to say that, like, it's true that compared to the past, you know, like, we don't have like strong, fiery voices coming from, you know, the West Bank or Gaza or inside 48, but we do have a more coherent movement in the United States when it comes to Palestine than the one that we had a few decades ago. So I'm saying this as a sign of hope that we're actually, we might be an exception, but we are moving forward with our movement. We do have some coherence. We have some clarity for what are the next steps for us as Palestinian Americans.
And in that vein, actually, I wanted to ask the rest of the panelists, what are, in your view, what are some of the major accomplishments, or let's just say failures, of the Palestinian diaspora in the United States in developing, let's just say, a cohesive way forward politically and societally? And I'm interested in seeing what you guys think is a litmus for this assessment. You know, what's the metric that we're using to clearly say whether we're being successful or whether we are failing?
And I think what Raed laid out and what Loubna laid out in terms of the history of our work in this country speaks to the advances that the diaspora has contributed to, in particular in the United States. I think that there's another way to look at this rather than just successes or failures, but what have been the struggles that have continued to contribute, right, to our movement. And, you know, I wonder, like yesterday there was a panel organized by the Arab American Action Network about the Detroit workers who went on strike in solidarity with Palestine as part of the United Auto Workers Union. And I wonder what would be possible today if our young people understood that history as part of the history of the 1936 revolt in Palestine, as part of the history of the ways in which we've had divestment resolutions across this country, as part of the history of BDS broadly speaking, as connected to the work of the legislations that Raed spoke of the history that Loubna spoke of, right? So if we are able to actually draw a through line for our young people in particular today, there's a lot of possibility there for them to understand themselves as not only contributing to Palestinian solidarity work and Palestinian liberation, but as a part of it historically, and as their families and their movements and the communities that they are also growing up in the Bay Area or across the country, right, that they all also have contributed to that. I think the one success we've had is not only that we passed legislation, not only that we passed resolutions, not only that we boycotted, not only that we've stopped the Israeli Zimship from indefinitely docking at the port of Oakland, not only that students continue to organize BDS resolutions across the country, not only that legislators are speaking about Palestine on the floor, but also we're pushing the conversation around other progressive issues. It's not that Palestine has become a progressive issue. It's that Palestine then advances progressive issues, that we actually begin to have to insert conversation around militarism, around imperialism, around settler colonialism of this land, right? So we have an opening and an opportunity to do so. And both the fact that there's so much repression against that same work, against BDS, against legislation in support of Palestine, speaks to how impactful it is and how much work is necessary on our parts to equip our allies and our partners and our communities across the country and across the world with the tools necessary to deal with that repression so that they can do that that work even better so that they can deepen that conversation. But that in of itself is a success. I think the fact that Palestine is so criminalized in this country speaks to how successful our work has been. And the idea that Movement for Black Lives comes out in support of Palestine, that in Native America, the Red Nation comes out in support of Palestine, that people in this country are understanding those connections, that it's impossible to disconnect that, and pushes other organizations and other movements to have internal conversations around what does actual solidarity look like? What does being a progressive today mean? What does it mean to be anti-racist? What is the intersection between white supremacy, fascism, and Zionism? These are all advances of our movement in diaspora, but also in our homeland. And like, we want to make sure that we also don't disconnect ourselves from that, right? There is a through line there as well. But I think all of that speaks to the successes. And I think there's a lot of advances we've made. And if we can draw that through line for our young people in particular today, how they see themselves as part of the struggle will radically shift and make possible deep cross-movement building and possibilities of campaigns and struggles in this country that we haven't seen before, given this political moment and how fruitful it is based on what everyone has already shared.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lara and Raed and Taher. I think I won't repeat what my co-panelists have already said. I completely agree with all of that, and I just want to reiterate, like, you know, the last decade we've really seen monumental change in different sectors and different fields and different disciplines that, you know, our communities have been long standing to sort of change the status quo. So I think that we should be really proud and we should really celebrate some of those victories, understanding that they're very small in relationship to the sort of longer term work that we have to do. But I think just to sort of offer some of like a little bit of a cynical viewpoint, because I think sometimes cynicism could be really generative and relevant in terms of anchoring a stronger movement. I think it's really important to think about the changes that have happened here in the United States in relationship to the Palestinian national political field. And quite frankly, you know, 30 years of deadlock negotiations, over 40 rounds of negotiations between the Palestinian leadership and Israel. The Trump administration, we sort of broke out of that negotiations framework. Now Biden is back and the PA is resorting back to it. What that has done, one of the most dangerous things that the Oslo Accords has produced is a dismemberment of the Palestinian body politic infrastructurally and its national program and project. But also it shifted the center of gravity for the Palestinian struggle. If international diplomacy and advocacy are the primary tools that the Palestinian leadership has said is the way that they're going to be facilitating this struggle, and they've emptied all of the other things in their arsenal in terms of how to wage a struggle against the colonial force, then that means that the center of gravity is no longer the occupied homeland. The center of gravity is no longer the refugee camp. The center of gravity is now here in the United States. The battle between Palestine and Zionism is taking place here in US institutions. Not that it never has, right? Because it's always, the US has always been the heart of empire and an imperialist force. But in this particular moment, if the Palestinian establishment is saying that the path toward liberation is through negotiations facilitated through the White House, then that makes the political movement in the United States ever more important. Now, we can all have our critique about the PA and the Palestinian political field, but I think as we are doing this work and as we are building a multi-pronged liberation movement here in the United States, deeply entrenched into the social, cultural, political fabric of US institutions, as Lara said, Palestine is not an exceptional issue. We're not doing this only for Palestine, but because we see it as part of global movements for justice and freedom, right? And as we're doing that, we also have to be attentive to the fact that we need to think about what it is that we can do to really push our leadership as Palestinians, part of the national body politic, away from this deadlock that we have arrived to in the negotiations process, and the way that it's facilitating increased Palestinian land loss and powerlessness. I think that that's really important. And that's what I mean when I say this is slightly cynical, because yes, we have accomplished a lot, but based on this political moment, we need to do more in the United States. And based on this political moment, as we're doing more, the backlash and Zionist power in the United States is getting more powerful. So it's not like we can just claim, you know, the last 10 years, we saw over 200 student divestment victories. And as those victories are rolling out, the power of Zionist repression, the power of Zionist's grip over university administrations, whether it's through legislation or withdrawing funds, it's getting stronger. So the more work we do, the more work we have to do. And so right now is really that critical moment where I think we really need to strategize as a community nationwide on how to grow and how to strengthen our bases, because it's sorely needed.
And that's something that I really wanted to come to, is that we talk about Palestinian leadership and we talk about holding them accountable, but like, what mechanisms are in place in order for us to do that, especially since all of the institutions that gave the diaspora power have ceased to exist? And so, you know, essentially collapsing in the post-Oslo period. Are there efforts to reclaim or reestablish those institutions or those mechanisms to hold leadership accountable? Or are we just sort of talking out in the air here? I mean, we need something viable to give our community something to work on in order for us to actually say that, you know what, we're going to hold these people accountable. We're going to change the direction of our internal politics in order for us to widen our scope or arsenal, so to speak, of resistance against Zionism. Where, as you said, very, very clearly and correctly, that it's been limited so far. So how do we navigate that? And I think that's something that is a lot of people's minds.
I mean, I can weigh in quickly on that one, just to say that I feel like I want to introduce a theory of change here that does not include us as Palestinian Americans flying to Gaza or to Ramallah to speak to Abbas or to Hamas and convince them to improve their leadership, but rather think about our role in the United States as something that would end up creating the right space for Palestinians in historic Palestine to improve the leadership of Palestinians inside Palestine. So, like, to expand on that thought, I think if we were, as Palestinian Americans, to succeed in our efforts in holding our own government here accountable and reduce the blank check support to Israeli crimes, that would create a different environment on the ground in Palestine that would make it easier for Palestinians in historic Palestine to pressure the Palestinian leadership to improve the Palestinian leadership. And I say this because of two reasons. The first one is that I feel like we have a lot of work to do here in the United States, and this work would take all hands on deck, would barely cause a dent in what we're trying to cause in the US. And on the other hand, I want to say that I have so much faith in Palestinians in historic Palestine. I have faith in their judgment. I have faith in their capability to improve their leadership without having someone like me from Washington, D.C. who will fly there and improve their leadership for them. So I'm using the word them as like, our communities who are still in historic Palestine. So that's why I think, like, to answer your question, Taher, we do have, by pressuring our government to, here in the United States, to become less involved in the negative aspects in the Israel-Palestine situation, we're actually helping in that direction by pressuring our, for example, our elected officials to co-sponsor HR 8050, which makes prohibits the U.S. from recognizing settlements and prohibits the U.S. from funding settlements. We're actually helping shift the facts on the ground and the conditions on the ground to a place where Palestinians in historic Palestine can play a more active role in improving their leadership there. So that's the thought that I wanted to share.
I would echo all that and just say that the ongoing organizing in the United States does contribute to delegitimizing apartheid Israel. And that is necessary if we're going to put pressure on any decision makers or any of those who are negotiating, right, with Israel. So at the end of the day, we are playing a role. Whether or not we're building institutions back home is a different question, and for folks there to speak to directly. But I think at the end of the day, we are in fact organizing to isolate Israel politically, culturally, and economically. And that work here in the United States, whether it's in Congress or in the streets, is in fact contributing to the possibility of actually delegitimizing our leadership also in Palestine, that is continuing to disenfranchise our communities and sell us short. And all of that in conjunction with the solidarity work that's happening, with the ways in which the Arab and Palestinian movements have continued to center Black liberation and power, have continued to center Native liberation and power, and that is, reciprocal across the board, across the world. I think that is what's going to make possible some new revived movements on the ground there. But all the while, we can't also dismiss the fact that there have been ongoing resistance movements in Palestine, with or without those institutions. They are learning from the past. They are really taking power in the present and really envisioning what future they want, whether or not it's through traditional institutions or not. And many of them have been assassinated as a result in recent years, as we can name. So I think all of that is to say that we are in fact doing that work, and there's more work to be done, and we are living in a different moment, but there's still some question around how can we understand the work we're doing here as actually contributing to the possibility of something very different on the ground there.
Loubna, did you want to add any thoughts to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of those comments I agree with entirely. And I think, in the last 15 years, we've seen, I don't know, over 24 initiatives that have gathered Palestinians from all over the world and all different parties and all different geographies to try to resolve this political impasse that we're at, the crisis, the split between the Palestinian factions or the defunct PLO. And I think that a lot of them have had good, generative lessons that have been pulled from them, a lot of great connections that were made, a lot of exchange of ideas on how to move and build in our different locales, but none of them have single-handedly been able to, to change our political predicament, which is that we remain geographically fractured, ideologically fractured, and we still have this Palestinian leadership that is not necessarily representing the interest of the grassroots people, it's not democratically elected, only represents, and even, doesn't represent the Palestinian people in their entirety, right? Whether it's by factions that are excluded from the Palestinian leadership or geographies excluded. But I think that something that I think is really important is that we have to be able to sustain this anti-colonial, anti-Zionist struggle that we are doing very well at in the United States, whether it's the advocacy work in DC, whether it's on the streets with other movements. But I think that we really need to take a turn inward and start thinking of this decolonial work that we need to do as a community, building up our bases. At this point, our bases, our Arab Palestinian bases in the United States should be much larger. They should be much more active. There should be easier mechanisms where everyday Palestinian or Arab communities who are not, working in organizations, who are not working in the academic field or working for one of the Palestine nonprofit organizations are able to contribute and participate in the struggle in a day-to-day mechanism. And if we are able to do that base building through education with our youth, through cultural programming, through meeting the social service needs of our community. We cannot go to our community and say, hey, do this political work when people are really struggling, whether it's from racist state violence of the United States or exclusion or economic precarity. We need to do better at taking care of our community as part of our base building so that when that moment comes where there is that other initiative and there are grassroots experiences from Germany, from London, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Tunisia, that we can be in a better position to actually rekindle our relationships with other communities. I don't think that moment is now. And I think that because that moment is not now, a lot of people are revisiting the question about a potential Palestinian National Council election, legislative elections. And I just don't think that's going to bring about the political change we need. I don't think our problem is a problem of representation, right? We could go to elections tomorrow and vote in new political leadership of the PLO, but if we are stuck in this kind of system of power that we're in, we're not going to realize the political change that we really desperately need. So I think definitely focusing on the local gradual base building in our communities is something that we could do better at.
100%, and I think that's a very critical element of the work that we're doing in the United States. I wanted to ask a final question that any of you feel free to answer, and that question it really is about our vision for the way forward, especially considering the political realities that we're in? What trajectory do we have for our community? Where do we see, especially in the growing political role that we're playing in the United States, how are Palestinian-Americans navigating this new political reality where you have representation in Congress, you have people who are more willing and outspoken? What can we look forward to, and what do you hope to see from your own perspective? Raed, feel free to start.
I'll go last.
Loubna, Lara?
I'll just say one thing that I think is really an overlooked change that's happening is I think that the normalization of BDS initiatives, I think having Congresswomen like Rashida Tlaib in office, I think that, a lot of people are sort of banking on those types of things as bringing about the change. Whereas for me, I think one of the things that has been important is that it's allowed for pushing our own communities who long were kind of reserved around being more overtly political or more overtly engaged in political change. I think it's helped us push them. It's put Palestine out in the open now, right? It's not like this behind closed doors conversation that people should be afraid of because of the repression. The repression is there, we're naming it and we're fighting it. And I think that that's something that this moment really offers us, which is that we are able to be more, we're able to push our communities on things that I think we struggled with in the last 2 decades, particularly following the war on terror, and the many different forms of repression and criminalization that we are enduring. And I think that it's now become part of our narrative. Like when Palestinians talk about what it means to be Palestinian in the US, what it means to be politically active in the US, there's not an ignorance about what comes with that, about the backlash and the repression and the threats to job security or to protection and safety that comes with that. I think it's becoming a part of our narrative that we're really expressing. And I think that that's something that we should own and really come together and fight collectively with. I think that there's a lot more courage right now. And I think that that's an opportunity that is, the new political field in the US has offered us. There's also, in other ways, like the danger of a Biden administration coming back in and restabilizing the sort of status quo 2-state solution negotiations deadlock that we've been in for a long time. But I think our communities have gotten organized enough in the last 4 years under the Trump administration to sort of really push the bar on that politic and not allow us to sort of default back to it.
Yeah, I think it's also good to remember that, the structures of oppression and exploitation mobilize the most egregious violence against the actual advances of our movements, right? So when we are doing good work and when we're succeeding is when we see that increased repression. And at the end of the day, it's not a coincidence that so many of the movements we named today are also understanding Palestine as center to their own movements for liberation. And not as a new thing, as I said earlier, but as something historic. And that has a lot to do with this political moment as well, with this pandemic really bringing to surface global capitalism and the exploitation of working people across the world, and the role of the United States in particular in the West in reproducing those forms of oppression across the world. And so there's solidarity that's being built there, but also a task at hand for us today is to continue to build in that regard, to center working class people, to actually understand the struggles of those most disenfranchised in our communities, in the Arab communities, to also connect the dots between what's happening in Palestine to what's happening in Yemen, to also connect the dots between what's happening in Yemen to what's happening here. And I think there's a lot of potential there, and there's a lot of movement building that we can continue to build on. But the most important thing for us to do is to really see those intersectionalities as historic, as something we should root ourselves in and build on and teach our young people about. I think that is really what's made possible today, given all the work of so many folks in AMP and other organizations and my co-panelists and the organizations they're involved in, and also made possible by our ancestors who fought for this for so many years for us to be at this moment. I think we are in a great moment of potential. I think there's a lot to learn from in terms of what's made possible. And I also think there's a lot of struggling to do, which is why I appreciate this conversation conversation, because there's a lot of questions we don't have the answers to. We are in a unique position, in a situation, but just like we're uniquely positioned as Palestinians in a very particular way at the receiving end of a very intense colonization and imperialism in our homelands and experiencing that in diaspora, we are also uniquely positioned to advance deep conversations around solutions, around visions for liberation, around how to make connections to this fight for democracy here in the United States, to the fight for economic and social justice globally. And there's a lot of potential for that. It makes me hopeful, especially as we see what's happening in Congress and what we see, even this Biden win, as dangerous as it may be for Palestine, we have to also see this as a victory against fascism and a victory against Trump, and what is more possible as a result of that, which is why so many Arabs were actually deeply engaged in this electoral work this year, because we understood what's at stake, right? And I think these kinds of connections and understanding the wrath of fascism and move to the right across the world, and what we can do if we actually mobilize to fight for democracy, is actually a hopeful place, and especially for the young people that are growing up in this moment, that is a very unique position to be in, but also very hopeful in the ways in which we've been building across movements, and also understanding these connections between different struggles of oppression.
Yeah, I agree with everything, and I love all the suggestions given by my co-panelists. I want to add that getting engaged with advocacy in DC and back in your districts is extremely important, especially now. I think many people might be feeling less stressed out or more relieved because of the change in administration. And this is definitely not a time to relax and stop pressuring the U.S. government to change its policies. So I think getting engaged with more political work in DC is extremely important. Grassroots work in the district means a lot. AMP organized our largest advocacy day this year with over 750 people, and we ended up with more than 150 congressional meetings. I attended many of the meetings, and it's amazing to see the impact that these meetings have when you attend meetings with folks who live in the district. It's very different than just me in DC chatting with them about policy issues. To have someone who lives in their district, who votes for them, who is in the district, there's a very different relationship, and it was very impactful. I'm hoping that everyone on the call today will sign up to receive updates from AMP and other organizations. Many of our partners here in DC do amazing work. Other Muslim organizations, Jewish organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, Christian organizations like CMAP and other close partners to us. So it's important to sign up for updates, take action. Many of our organizations offer advanced kind of advocacy venues. Like a good example is AMP has an entire program called Palestine Advocacy Corps. So if you sign up for Palestine Advocacy Corps, you pay $10 a month or something. You end up getting monthly action alerts that are way more advanced. You pick up the phone to talk to the State Department or to members of Congress. You can ask questions to members of Congress that we meet with. Like, for example, in the next few days, this Thursday, actually, on December 3rd, we have an event where we invited, we will have Congressman Pocan, who is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, to speak about his most recent letters on Palestine. We also invited 4 speakers from Palestine to be on the call, 2 from Gaza and 2 from the West Bank, to speak about COVID, home demolitions. These are Palestinians from Khan al-Ahmar, from like amazing voices that we need to hear. If you become a part of the Palestine Advocacy Corps, you can ask questions to members of Congress and to these participants. So I mean, I don't want to use this as a pitch only for AMP. I'm just giving an example of how our organization and many other organizations are doing this kind of work weekly. You can see that this event we have co-sponsored or hosted with the Rebuilding Alliance, one of our close allies here in DC. So that's my I think like one thing that everyone on this call can do and should do is get engaged. You know, sign up to as many organizations as you could. Get action alerts. Contact your members of Congress. Build a personal relationship with your district offices of your representative and 2 senators. Call the White House and the State Department as a part of an effort of the movement when we have very clear asks that we're trying to pursue. These things make a huge difference. Like when we have a few hundred people call, is very different than having a few thousand people call. So I'm hoping that everyone will not only join us today for the webinar, but will also engage with taking action on an ongoing basis. We have a lot of work to do in the upcoming months.
If it's all right, Taher, could I speak again to this point?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Raed, you're just, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, just this question of advocacy. And I know our communities have struggled with this question for a long time about whether it's our role, whether it's effective, whether we'd ever see real change. But I just do want to highlight that we have a number of Arab and Palestinian and Muslim organizations who had been doing advocacy for a very long time in the United States since the 1980s, really, in a really concerted way. And even in the early diasporic Arab organizations in the 1940s and 30s, they were doing forms of advocacy also. But I think that the difference of this moment is that people are not losing their, congressional representatives are not losing their races because of Palestine. In fact, they won it because of their positions on Palestine. And there's legislation on the table that people are not doing despite their voters. I mean, I know they're getting a lot of backlash, but they're doing it because it is a mechanism to retain their seats. And if we just take a comparative look between the Democratic primary debates this year and 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, or 12 years ago, we'll see historically that Democratic candidates were competing with each other on who was more pro-Zionist. And this year, they avoided the question. I mean, they didn't go toward our direction, right? But they avoided the question because they know that voters don't want that same business as usual politics. That change has to do also with grassroots work, right? So the development of what can happen in DC with legislation, with electoral candidates, that's only going to change when we can really sustain and retain the grassroots changes in all fields and sectors of society that has been accruing for a very long time. And I think that this goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that it's such an important and urgent moment, a moment that really requires all of us to do all kinds of different work that we never even thought of as political engagement before. Our creativity needs to be like the sharpest it's ever been in this moment, because we have huge roles to play in tech. We have, to combat the censorship that we're experiencing. We have huge roles and that could engage people who work in tech, for example, people who are not typically engaged in political work, right? So I think that this is something that we have to really think about regarding strengthening our grassroots bases, because we need to sustain the sort of vibrant, multi-pronged strategy at a grassroots level in all fields, in all constituent communities, in order to really realize the change that we're trying to see at the federal or governmental level, I should say, not just federal, but at the governmental level. And that this opportunity is really prime time for that.
Thank you all sincerely from the bottom of my heart for all of your incredible input in this discussion. And I think for me personally, this is the beginning of hopefully a series of internal Palestinian discussions about the way forward. And I think these forums are not always available to us. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really continue this discussion in this period when, it would not require so much resources to meet. Rather, we can do things virtually and continue these important conversations moving forward. And you all have done such an extraordinary job at contributing to this, I think, rich and much needed discussion about the future of the Palestinian diaspora, our role, and hopefully a stronger position moving forward in the years to come. Lara, Loubna, and Raed, I want to thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and I hope to be seeing you all soon again in person once things clear up. And I pray for your safety and your health and your family's safety and health moving forward. And please keep us all in your prayers as well as we navigate these difficult moments in our human history with this pandemic. And before we wrap up the program and this final session of our conference, I wanted to thank a few people. I wanted to thank, first of all, our sponsors, the Mosque Foundation, for constantly being a bedrock supporter of AMP over the years. An extraordinary mosque in Chicago, the heart of the Palestinian community in Bridgeview, Illinois, and they continue to support our efforts tirelessly and without condition. And so we appreciate them so much, and their board and staff and leadership. I want to thank the companies that supported our raffle this year: Nominal, Halal Socks, Interlink Publishing, and Kufiyya Masks. Please visit them and their websites and support their businesses. Nominal, an extraordinary company, Palestinian-owned, does amazing work in providing fashion and accessories, and of course all the other companies as well. I really want to thank our team, our staff at AMP, who have put this thing together. We've been working for the past couple months and organizing this virtual convention and treading in sort of unfamiliar waters, trying to navigate how we're going to do this convention virtually. And I could say without a doubt that it has been an extraordinary success. I want to thank our managing director, Josh Rubner. I want to thank our ones and twos man, our backstage man, Hadith Adluni, for incredible branding and marketing work and producing this virtual conference. I want to thank our team of the conference planning committee, our board members at AMP, and our force, and definitely not least, our executive director, Dr. Osama, who has worked tirelessly to ensure that this work continues for not just the next month or two, but for the years to come, and that we can never say thank you enough. I want to give a shout out and thanks to all of our chapters, from New Jersey to Chicago, to St. Louis, to Dallas, Texas, to the Bay Area in California, to our beloved chapter in Minnesota, and beyond. And thank you all so much for continuing this work, for standing resolutely in support of this cause, despite the circumstances, despite the repercussions, for being the leaders of this Palestine work across the country. Our grassroots is what makes us so strong, and what gives myself, Raed, and all the DC staff the ability to go with our heads high into the halls of power and demand the things that we want demand for our Palestinian people. So we thank you, we appreciate you for all of the work you are doing. This conference has been such an incredible journey. 9 sessions in 3 days, just bringing together a wide range of people from across the globe, from Palestine, from around the world. I want to thank the members of Congress who joined us for our panels: Congresswoman Betty McCollum, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and I want to thank our panelists who joined us from Turkey, from Palestine, from Jordan, from here and across the United States, who made our discussions rich about the role of the Palestinian diaspora, who gave us in-depth analysis about U.S. politics and what that will mean for Palestine moving forward, especially with this new administration. We had an incredible student panel on Friday evening that talked about the success of student movements for Palestine. We had an incredible panel yesterday in the morning to talk about the importance of Jerusalem within the broader Islamic framework, and bringing Muslim communities together to talk about Palestine in a more systematic and direct way. And of course, our wonderful panel today. And I hope and pray that with the end of this pandemic, we will be able to join each other again in a festive environment, and hopefully produce another wonderful convention next year in Chicago or beyond in 2021 as we join together. I salute all of you and I thank you, and please support our efforts. If you didn't catch our the gala last night, please visit us at palestineconvention.org/donate and support our efforts. It's really critical at this juncture, at this moment, that we do not let up, that we continue and expand our support for Palestine work in this country. We are one vehicle of that support, of course. We are not the only ones, but we do offer an incredible array of work and things that has been done over the years for Palestine from a grassroots level, from an advocacy standpoint, from a media and communication standpoint. And we urge you all to support our efforts as we continue on this journey for a liberated Palestine. Again, my name is Taher Herzallah, and I want to sign you off with a greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.